call the meeting to order. Wendy Muller's here from Compass Point Planning to give us an overview of the new zoning and signage code. So Wendy, you have the floor.
Thank you. So, again, my name's Wendy Muller with Compass Point Planning. For most of you here, you know who I am. You've seen me enough over the last year. For those who might be seeing this online, I'm a community planning consultant who has been working with the city for just over a year now to kind of work to update the city's planning and zoning ordinances, which really focus on how the city develops, what kind of land uses are allowed, and what kind of structures can be constructed. So I have been working over that last year largely with the Planning Commission, but we've had a couple of public meetings. We had an online survey to kind of gather feedback on particular issues, and I've also been working with Joshua on some of the cleanup just from making it easier to administer and enforce. So this has kind of been an evolving process as we go along. So the purpose of tonight is to have a chance to kind of present what the changes are in the updated ordinance before we even get to the adoption. So at this point, nothing has been approved. At this point, there can be changes, all kinds of, we can continue to kind of revise this. So we just want to give an opportunity to kind of put this out there, give people kind of an update that what are the next steps. And the most critical one right now coming up is next Tuesday at 1 o'clock. The Planning Commission will take the first kind of major step with adoption, where they will have their public meeting to review this. Tonight, the idea is anybody can have comments or questions, and we'll try to answer them. If it results in any kind of recommended changes, we will forward that to the Planning Commission. I won't be making any actual changes to the draft between now and Tuesday, but we might recommend that the Planning Commission consider adopting some additional revisions. This ordinance can be revised all the way up until the point that City Council, who formally is the formal responsible party to adopt this. Once they adopt it, that's the format it is in until or unless it's amended later on. So I just want to let people know. And then for those who are online who might have a comment later on, we'll maybe post with this the ability to reach out to, I don't know, Mayor or Joshua, if we want to have a specific person to direct this to. We'll post that online, and you can forward comments that way, or again, forward comments towards the Planning Commission. So starting way back in the beginning of this, the goals for this project, as directed to me, were to modernize the regulations, to address ongoing administrative and enforcement issues. There were some things where there was questions of what belongs in the zoning ordinance and what belongs in the building and property maintenance codes, to clarify the review procedures. And then, like every other community, we had to have the talks about housing and making sure that a reasonable amount of housing can be constructed. So kind of make sure we don't have any barriers to housing development. Make it easier to invest in the city. Make sure that we're not forcing people to go through extensive reviews or procedures that aren't really necessary because they're doing what the city would like them to do. And then kind of building in what I called flexibility with predictability. So there isn't really a one solution that will fit every development in the city. It never is. So we tried to work in some options where there's a little bit of flexibility that we'll talk about as we go through in like parking and landscaping, where there's different approaches to meet the goals and the set vision for why we have those regulations, without having to do it one specific way. So we've given a little bit of flexibility, but the predictability is there's enough guidance in this code to kind of let you know what the end result should be. So the first step we did was what we called a code audit report, and that was probably one of the last big public meetings we had beyond the general planning commission meetings. This report was a blueprint for determining the direction of the future updates. So we kind of put together a narrative of here are the major changes we would suggest based on everything we'd heard into that point. And that was released in February of 2023. So again, just about a year and a half ago. The code recommended kind of 4 overall themes of change. one of which was the easy one, like reorganizing and reformatting it just so it's easier to find what you're looking for, to understand how things go through the process. Updating administrative procedures, restructuring the districts and use regulations, and then modernizing those substantive standards. Substantive standards being parking, landscaping, signs, architectural review, all the pretty picture stuff. So within each of those in the code audit, we had various specific recommendations that were then carried forward into the actual drafting. Now, I'm not going to go through all those because they are incorporated into the change we have that we're going to be talking about. So the rest of this presentation is just me kind of walking through each of the chapters and highlighting the significant changes that are in there. There's a lot of change, don't get me wrong. We were starting with an ordinance that was missing some critical pieces that most codes have, and I'm not trying to say that we were trying to be, add regulations. We were actually trying to add things that would give guidance that wasn't there. Things that the city, wanted to, at least check in on to maintain that kind of level playing field, but was just missing. And so it was really just, again, going back to the whole modernization thing. So the first chapter, the general provisions, is one of the easiest ones. It's the boilerplate language that almost every code in America has. It's got the purpose for it. It's got the authority for the city to have zoning. It mandates compliance with the zone. It says you have to comply with planning and zoning. We've created a connection to the master plan that's continuing to be, is evolved. There's portions of it that are updated, but they are continuing to build on that. We've added a provision that clearly notes the city is not responsible for enforcing HOA or third-party agreements. I'm not sure how many calls you get on a regular basis that says, my neighbor is doing this, when it has nothing to do with what the city requires. The city is not going to spend their resources out there enforcing those kind of private easements. One of the critical pieces we added in here was transitional regulations. So this will be really important for the next year or two. These are the regulations that says somebody got their application for a zone change or conditional use in, 2 days before this goes effective. How is this handled? How do you handle this? Well, this says if you had a complete application when you submitted, you go under the zoning code that was in effect at that time. So if you went in 2 days before this new code becomes effective, you can go through the old code, or you can opt into the new code. And then there's some incentive to some degree. Again, we made it easier to understand things like signage and stuff, that they may opt into the new code, but they would have the option. So again, for the next year or two, that's one to be able to refer to. At some point, it kind of phases out its necessity. The second chapter, 1102, is about the decision-making roles and authorities. So this is primarily about the different review boards and staff. So you have the Planning Commission, you have City Council, you have what is now the Downtown Design Review Board. I'll talk about that here in a second, and then the Code Administrator. The major changes from the current code to the new code with regards to this is that we have recommended the Planning Commission take on the review of conditional uses. Right now, that lies at the Board of Zoning Appeals. The reason being is that's kind of aligns with what is very common practice in Ohio municipalities is the Planning Commission reviews those uses. It also seems to align more with the overall purpose of the Planning Commission. The other major change, as I mentioned, the Downtown Design Review Board, that is currently found in the Building Code, Part 13. We're moving that into the Planning and Zoning Code because that's where they fit better. And we're also renaming that board to the Design Review Board for a critical reason, which is right now they focus on downtown design review, and that will continue. We've also set it up that down the road, if the city wants to move into historic preservation, and I'm not saying, extensive guidelines or anything like that, but they want to establish local districts or local landmarks, this board could step in through the setup we have to serve as that kind of historic preservation board. There is no designation now. This ordinance will not designate anything as historic. We're just setting up the processes and the boards that would be available to do that in the future. Chapter 1103 is the actual review procedures. All of the review procedures, the conditional uses, variances, appeals, subdivision, code compliance, all of that has been consolidated into this chapter. We've created, the only exception is plan unit developments, and I'm going to talk about those later. We've established one section that has all the common review requirements. So how do you deal with fees? What about public notice for meetings? What is the right of somebody to go and see the documents and the applications? How do you handle tabling meetings or withdrawing applications? All of those, so you don't have to constantly repeat them, are in one section. Each procedure now has been outlined in a very clear literal step-by-step process. And each of them has established a set of review criteria. So what is the applicable board looking for what's the planning commission gonna look for when they're doing a conditional use review? What's the BZA looking at for a variance? What is city council and planning commission looking at for a zone change? We've added a couple of new procedures. One is an alternative equivalency review. We call this a positive variance. So if somebody comes in and says, hey, I see that you want me to do this landscape buffer between the parking lot and the street in the central business district. I have this great idea. I want to propose doing some kind of public art instead of trees or vegetation. Well, typically, the only way to get around the requirements is go to the BZA for a variance. But typically with a variance, you have to say, oh, there's a hardship, and typically you're trying to reduce the standard. Here, you're actually trying to do something better. You're trying to do something more positive, and there really isn't a hardship to it. So for a limited set of standards, lighting, architecture, landscaping, and parking, we've given the authority to the Planning Commission or the Design Review Board for downtown to have a public hearing to consider alternatives for these certain standards. They are on a case-by-case basis. You would have to demonstrate that they meet or exceed the intent of those regulations. But it gives, again, some of that flexibility to do creative approaches that we just maybe couldn't think of as we were developing this process. We already mentioned the conditional uses are moving to Planning Commission. We have eliminated the ability to go to the Board of Zoning Appeals and ask for a use variance. So use variance is where you are asking to put a use into a zoning district that's not allowed. You're asking to put an automobile filling station in a residential district. That's an extreme version of it. Many communities do allow that. However, the desire would be to do a zoning amendment because you have a little bit more control to look at, is that an appropriate area for commercial? So we talked about how do we limit this to places where you've got a unique building. Old church in a residential district that really can't be revamped as a residential use, but it's not, maybe it's vacant and you'd like to see it reused. So we've removed the ability to do use variance and instead added a conditional use called adaptive reuse of pre-existing buildings. So if a building existed before the effective date of this code, and it's not easily designed for something that could be accommodated, they can go to the Planning Commission and suggest something that would fit in with that particular area. We've added a clear procedure for minor subdivisions and major subdivisions that are missing from the current regulations. The current regulations kind of get it a little bit at it, but it's not very clear, so we've stepped that up. We've added the procedure that if in the future the city wants to designate historic districts or historic landmarks, they can go through a process for that. And it would end up going through up to council. We've moved all the information related to downtown review and the Downtown Design Review Board into this chapter. We've made a lot of changes to the procedures. I promise this is one of the few chapters that has 3 slides. We have completely rewritten, and I've probably rewritten it a couple times after many calls with Joshua to make sure this works well for the city. But we completely rewrote the procedure for ensuring compliance under what we're calling a certificate of zoning compliance. So for the most part, if you have to do something with the building permit, it's all going to be kind of reviewed together, the zoning and the building. But there are a lot of things that may, raise to the need for the city to ensure compliance that may not need a building permit. Certain fences aren't gonna need one. A change in use was a big discussion we had. The city would like to be able to, monitor where there's a change in use or tenancy. Not residential, this isn't about checking when a resident moves out of a rental and another moves in. This is when, a restaurant moves out of one building and a new one goes in. And then finally, we've added an administrative waiver procedure under the zoning permits or certificates of zoning compliance, I should say. This is a procedure that for certain dimensional requirements, the code administrator will be able to waive a dimensional standard up to 10% if they find that it meets the variance requirements. So there's some kind of practical difficulty. They also have the opportunity to push it up to the Board of Zoning Appeals for a variance if there's kind of a question of them meeting it or not meeting it. The purpose of this is to make it a little easier, especially in the older parts of the city, where somebody has a unusually shaped lot and their building just kind of slips in a couple inches into a setback. But because of the weird shape of the lot, that's the practical difficulty. They wouldn't have to go to a Board of Zoning Appeals. They can, go to the code enforcer or the code administrator as part of their permits and certificates and get that approved. Again, making it easier to invest. Chapter 1104 is the establishment of the zoning districts, and this is where we establish what are the zoning districts in the city. There's a lot of change here as well. This table is in the zoning ordinance, and it shows how we've transitioned from the existing ordinance, the existing zoning districts, the existing zoning map to the new one. But I'm going to explain it. The biggest change, by far, is we went from one residential district, which I think you're the only city I've ever known to have one residential district. No, I'm sorry, you're the second. But the other one was a village, very small one. You only have one residential district where most have a couple. In the early discussions, we had a recommended approach that we kind of shift to having some different residential districts with different densities. So the biggest thing to understand with this is there are 4 new residential districts, 3 of which are on the zoning map, the draft zoning map. The new R1 is a single-family focused zoning district. Right now, your R district allows for 1-family dwellings and 2-family dwellings. Multifamily dwellings are conditional use. In the R1, the new R1, single-family are allowed, and 2-family or multifamily are conditional where they pre-existed. So we're not trying to make nonconformities. Those that exist in there are allowed. However, where you see them on the proposed zoning map, which I can bring up, the majority of those areas are already just single-family uses. The new R2 district is essentially the basic version, is the version of your current R district. So 1 and 2 family are allowed, multifamily are conditional use. And that is a predominant area of the city because all your older neighborhoods had those mix of uses. So those will continue to be R2 now. The new districts that, we really did create new and are very different from what you have now are the R3 and the R4. Starting backwards, the R4 is not on the proposed zoning map at this moment, but we did put in the option for a multifamily development if somebody wanted to come in and do something of that scale. They could come in and do a zoning map in the future. We do not have that on the zoning map now. It's all kind of addressed under the other zoning districts. The R3 district, which you can kind of see in the pinkish area around the blue central business district, is a new district that we developed to kind of encourage slightly higher densities around downtown, up to 8 units per acre. So we're encouraging things like townhomes, row houses, some low-intensity kind of apartments, again, to bring more people in walking distance of downtown. These areas that we've shown as R3 are currently on residential districts, so they're all remaining residential. But the hope is to encourage some kind of support around the downtown. Your existing house trailer park district is going to become the manufactured home park district. We are maintaining it for the purposes of protecting existing manufactured home parks. But from the effective date moving forward, you won't be able to build new, mobile home parks. We are not seeing those as a popular solution to housing right now because of EPA requirements and such. You have to keep in mind that the state requires that wherever you can build a single-family house, you can build a permanently sided manufactured home, as long as it's, again, mounted to a foundation and meets the state requirements. To the state, it's single-family. So you still can build, manufactured housing in the city, not just stick-built stuff, but it won't be in these parks. We have maintained all the various business districts and industrial districts, kind of rename them and tailor them a little bit more, just to give some clarification. But otherwise haven't really changed that or their boundaries. We created a new public facilities district for the large-scale institutional uses in the city, schools, the airport, and any other significant public uses. Eventually, churches could ask to be in this, but we didn't go and preemptively, zone every church this, but this is really to help define where your major institutional uses are. We've created a plan unit development district. Again, we've got a whole chapter on that I'll get to. And then finally, we created a corridor overlay district, which is designed that it could be placed on other gateways and corridors, but for the time being, we've just put it over the West High corridor. The purpose of this is to enhance landscaping and signage requirements along these major gateways. So we've done some things to require some streetscape trees, not necessarily in the right-of-way because there isn't a lot of right-of-way, but there would have to be some landscaping in the front of the buildings and in the front of the parking lot, just again to kind of enhance the corridor over time, because until somebody goes and rebuilds or redevelops a site, these regulations won't come into effect. Chapter 1105 actually gets into the what principal uses are allowed in each of those zoning districts. One of the biggest things you'll notice is the reorganization of everything into a use table now. So there isn't individual uses of list of uses allowed in the individual districts. Now you can see across the top are the zoning districts, and down the left-hand side are the uses that are allowed and how are they allowed across the board. We have done a couple of things. We clarified that agricultural uses are limited to crops and not to cattle or the raising of livestock. We've addressed group homes, homeless shelters, and other transitional housing to align with state law. We moved wind energy system regulations from the building code to this because it really relates largely to zoning. And then we added in a section on the purpose and the regulations related to corridor design overlay district. More importantly, we modernized that entire list of uses allowed. We have addressed, at least preliminarily, short-term rentals. I know the city continued to work on some business regulations related to them. But we have defined them, and we've set out that they would generally be limited to that R3 near downtown, R4, and the commercial districts. That could change in the future, but we wanted to kind of get ahead of the game here with this. Medical, recreational marijuana activities are prohibited in the city. That was actually a very easy conversation I think we had. We discussed adding the provision for adaptive reuse of pre-existing buildings. And again, we generally modernize the use of language. Every one of those uses in this table, every one of the uses in accessory use table are all defined. And so that gives some guidance in, like, how do you define what is a homeless shelter? That's defined in there, and those type of things. The Plan Unit Development District, this is an entirely new tool for the city, but it is a common tool in a lot of zoning ordinances across the U.S. A plan unit development is where there is a single district that typically accommodates a range of uses and activities and densities. The reason why it's plan unit development is quite often it's of a scale that would make it challenging to do, piece together all the zoning districts that are within the city. There's usually also some give and take. because unlike other zoning amendments where anybody can come in and ask to be changed from residential to commercial or whatever, here they have to come with a preliminary plan that shows uses, density, open space, circulation. I mean, they're essentially doing a site plan that is connected to the zone change and to the PUD approval. So somebody will come in and we have set some, criteria that requires them to be sizable in nature unless they happen to be close to downtown. They go through a zoning amendment process with a preliminary plan, and then they have to come back to the zoning or the planning commission for kind of final approval. The maximum densities of this, though, again, there's a lot of requirements to build up to this density, but if you are adjacent to downtown or you are connected to downtown with some kind of trail of 8 foot in width, you can get up to 24 units per acre in density. Some people might kind of freak out at that, but I would encourage you to go look at the code audit because we actually provided some visual examples of that. And that is roughly the density of housing you would have if all of the upper floors in downtown were occupied by dwelling units. So it just builds on the density that would come off of downtown. It is not, New York City or anything like that by any means. Outside of that area, they could achieve 18 units per acre, but as density goes up, we have stronger requirements for open space. So the higher density you have, not only the more open space you have to provide, but actually the more improvements you have to provide in open space. So if you want 18 units or 25 units per acre, you don't just get to preserve the leftover pieces of land that look green. You actually have to do improvements for community areas, for things that would create activity space for the residents of that density, actual functioning parks with improvements. None of this is on, again, the city hasn't had this tool before, so there are none on the zoning map. This would be a process that could come up in the future. It's particularly useful when there's major like mixed-use developments or major developments that'll have multiple phases that can go through this process. Chapter 1107, this is probably the last of the big changes because this one is one that every resident is going to be, every resident is very interested in. It's probably also the one that can cause the most problems and the most questions of interpretation. It's accessory uses and temporary uses, particularly accessory uses. So accessory uses that we're all familiar with are swimming pools and detached sheds and storage barns and trampolines and any of those things that are accessory to any use, but primarily, residential. So we went through and we modernized the list of accessory uses, which was pretty easy because the city only vaguely talked about accessory uses and it didn't get into kind of breaking it down into details. So we kind of provided some more guidance on things like outdoor dining. How do you provide outdoor dining specifically and especially where there's things like outdoor entertainment areas related to that. So, bands playing and stuff like that. We addressed accessory dwelling units and where those are allowed, rain barrels, community gardens, and all these kind of modern accessory uses. We clarified the regulations for detached accessory buildings beyond garages. The city vaguely references accessory buildings in their code now, but doesn't get really into how big can they be, where can they be, beyond kind of detached garages. So we provided some clarity. None of them can be bigger than the house, obviously, or taller. The one new thing we've added in here, particularly related to stormwater, is maximum lot coverages. So that's going to be a limiting factor. Every district has a maximum lot coverage of how much building can cover the lot and how much impervious surface, which is, you can't allow stormwater to go through, so pavement, sidewalks. You're not going to be able to pave your entire yard. We tried to be reasonable. We tried to spot check and make sure that we were kind of aligning with what's out there and not going to create more problems. But that limitation, that maximum lot coverage by building limitation, is also going to limit how many and how big of an accessory building you can get on your lot. If you've got a small lot, you might be able to get a storage barn or maybe a detached one-car garage, but it's going to take a little bit larger lot to get, you know, a bigger building. Most temporary uses are addressed outside the planning code, so we didn't really add a lot of language there, but we did address temporary sales, construction structures, and model homes. We've added provisions for garage and estate sales. You're not gonna require, you don't have to come in and get a permit or anything like that. But we wanted to provide, we've had this discussion, we wanted to provide teeth for enforcement to prevent people from having those continuous sales outside of their house, where instead of it being, you know, one weekend and you're trying to sell off your spring cleaning, to you've got stuff that you're selling every weekend for the year, or literally, I've seen examples of it, you know, every day, all the year. And then finally, we added regulations for mobile food vendors, and we looked at 3 different types. We want to encourage mobile food vendors, but we also don't want them, you know, occupying space that would deter from, you know, brick and mortar restaurants or other buildings. And we also wanted to give the opportunity for somebody to try out whether or not their restaurant concept would work, at least on a temporary basis, but not, you know, as a permanent fixture. Those rules would not apply to like city events or, you know, public festivals where you might bring in, you know, food trucks for those. But this would be on private property. Now we're getting into the substantive standards. This kind of gets a little smoother, I think. The general development standards, this is where we consolidated a lot of little small sets of regulations that apply across the board. We've added language to address outdoor lighting, especially lighting as it, you know, passes into residential lots. So we don't want people, commercial uses, you know, having light and glaring into residential lots. We've updated the fencing regulations to provide clearer guidance on location, height, and design standards. Actually, one of the last changes we made was to add provisions for retaining walls. I discussed adding provisions for maximum lot coverage. This chapter, while technically addresses a lot of small things, has probably the most graphics in it, because we have numerous graphics that illustrate setbacks. Where our setbacks are located, where are yards located, what about a corner lot, what about a through lot? So that it should be very easy to interpret where and how you can build stuff and what are the setbacks. And then we've added regulations for rain barrier systems to encourage their location in side and rear yards. Chapter 1109 on architectural standards, I don't know why CB, it's not actually just for the central business district, but we've added architectural standards for the community. We are not trying to be Hudson or Dublin or, you know, we're not trying to be overly fancy, but for big multifamily uses in the R3 and R4 district, for non-residential uses in the commercial districts, not industrial, and for downtown, we have separate architectural standards to basically prevent people from building like the box, just a plain old box. Again, we are not trying to, you know, tack on a ton of money and make it expensive to build in New Philadelphia, but we want to build a place that, you know, creates that gateways in those corridors. The downtown design regulations that are now in Part 13 of the building code are now in here, with more guidance and more teeth to focus on the central business district and make sure any infill or any renovations. Again, we're not talking high-level historic preservation stuff, but keep the rhythm of the buildings. Keep the, you know, you can still use modern materials. We're not saying it has to look old or anything like that, but keep the feel of downtown. 1110 on landscaping and screening. We created a modern set of landscaping and screening standards, focused primarily on screening between land uses, so between commercial and industrial and residential. When you get into the corridor design area, we have a little bit more on the street like landscaping. And then we also have provisions for using these landscaping areas for stormwater control and making it a little bit more natural. Parking access and connectivity, we've completely updated the parking requirements. The code still has ratios for parking on residential lots, but for non-residential uses like McDonald's, any of your commercial stuff, the applicant actually can come in, and we've got a procedure in there where when they submit their certificate of zoning compliance, they say, we're Walgreens, we're providing 20 parking spaces, and we think this is enough based on X, Y, and Z, number of employees, our typical thing. We have found that companies tend to overpark regardless of what the requirement is, and where we are requiring people a specific ratio, where we're off, and asking them to go through BZA for, not having 2 parking spaces is a waste of everybody's time and resources. So this has been working for a lot of communities to kind of ease that. We do have some things that the code administrator can look to make sure that, like, if they come in and say, we don't really need any parking, but it's Chick-fil-A, there are resources and there are standards by which the code administrator can look to and say, no, that's not gonna work here. We've added provisions for off-street parking and loading and for drive-through stacking lines. We've clarified where sidewalks are required and the pedestrian connections that would connect those sidewalks to businesses. Signs. Everybody starts laughing at this one. This completely looks different. We've gotten rid of the algebraic equations that currently litter the ordinance, and everybody that's had to deal with them now is smiling in here. We have now made it easier to understand how much signage you can have. If anything, we've probably given a little bit more signage. We've tried to lean towards a little bit more signage, not necessarily taller, but definitely more on like attached building signage. We've given a lot of flexibility on what kind of building signage you can have. So we say, you can get 40 square feet. You have the ability to pick and choose, is it a wall sign? Is it a projecting sign, canopy? We do not have, different maximum amounts for each one. The biggest change for this is a legal thing, and I've had a number of conversations with Marvin, the law director, about this. We had to eliminate content-based regulations, and that is where you basically have to read the sign to determine the special regulations. So where you have special provisions for real estate signs, how do you know it's a real estate sign? Well, if you have to read it, determines real estate, that's content-based. So we had to focus on structure types, structure heights, area, location, not about what is on the sign. That didn't really impact the permanent signs, but it does have an impact on temporary signs, because we all talk about temporary signs based on what their content is. So it's a political sign, it's a real estate sign, it's a construction sign, it's a grand opening sign. We can't talk about that anymore. So in going back and forth with the law director, we came up with this approach, which is there's a maximum amount of temporary signage allowed on any lot at any given time. We tried to accommodate kind of reasonable anticipation of what's going to happen during this political season, which is going to be our big one. Are we going to see more signs of this? Probably. I get it. But we had to put a number somewhere. The focus here is keeping the size and height to a reasonable amount. Obviously, if you get to a certain size, you're permanent in nature, just because you're going to have to get a permit. Once you get to that point, you're not a temporary sign. And then there are some things that, businesses in particular would be allowed to get some extra signage on a time-limited basis. But there's going to be an allowance for signage year-round, because free speech is year-round. Political signs used to be tied to just elections, but political signs, obviously, especially in the last 4 to 8 years, we've seen year-round, regardless of whether there's an election going on right now. We're almost there. Subdivision and design and public improvements. This chapter is almost entirely new. It draws some from the existing. There is one chapter that has some design improvements, but for the most part, the city's technical standards for building roads and infrastructure are found outside of these ordinances. So we have just cross-referenced those. For streets in particular, they use ODOT's manuals. So we've just said, hey, make sure you look at those, and so you have something to hang your hat on. We have expanded the regulations to address kind of common subdivision requirements. We pulled in some some revised provisions on condominium plats. And then we've also added a provision that would allow for somebody to choose to do green infrastructure. as an option, provided the city engineer or the city's engineering consultants, feel that that meets best practices. Nonconformities, these are the grandfathering clauses is what many people refer to them as. So this is uses, buildings and such that have been built, that were built legally at one point in time, but at some point a zoning amendment has made them not conform to zoning. Hopefully, we've greatly reduced the number of them, but we've never, I don't think any city doesn't have any nonconformities. There's no perfect solution. But what we've done is a couple of things. We've clarified the rules for nonconforming uses, structures, and nonconforming lots. Nonconforming uses are the biggest issue typically. They are uses that are no longer. So some of the ones that people like to try to get rid of are the old gas stations in a residential district, or old commercial, businesses at corners. Those, they have a time limit. If they go vacant for a period of a year, then they go away. Non-conforming structures or sites are different. That's where the use is fine, the use is allowed, but the building's in a setback or it doesn't meet the landscaping. This corridor design overlay district, we know going in that most of those lots are not going to meet the corridor landscaping requirements for the street. But that's a policy decision we made that long-term, we want people to come into compliance. But anybody along that corridor is fine until they start making changes. And then the final one is non-conforming lots. The city had okay regulations. This was a cleanup for the most part. I will say the one provision we added in here was to ensure that if anybody's home is non-conforming, regardless of the situation, if it burns to the ground or if it's destroyed by, completely, that it can be rebuilt. Part of that is most communities don't want to prevent somebody from rebuilding a house. But the other thing is that banks are no longer, or very few of them, are financing homes that cannot be rebuilt, which makes it very hard for people to sell their home or buy homes that would otherwise be available. Rounding out the last two chapters, enforcement and penalties. We've just moved all the enforcement provisions in here. This is only a couple pages long. The one thing we did is we did establish an escalating penalty for repeat offenders. If you fix a problem and then just do it again, repeatedly in the same year, your fines are going to increase. And then the final chapter, which is actually much bigger than the current one, is the definitions. So now you probably have about 10 pages of definitions. Now you've got closer to 30 or 40. That's because every use is defined. We rolled in the wind energy system, had their own page and a half, so we just made sure that, anything that could be questioned was defined. So that this is the new kind of glossary for the city. And that is the updated code. So the next steps are, we're going to entertain any questions or comments, take those to the Planning Commission. But the adoption process will start officially next Tuesday with the Planning Commission, although Council has already referred this to Planning Commission. The Planning Commission will review the draft that's online now. We will present any comments or suggested changes based on tonight or any comments we hear later on. The Planning Commission is responsible for making a recommendation to approve with changes or modifications, or they could recommend denial. I have never had that happen yet, but it is an option. They will make a recommendation to City Council. And then City Council and the committee that Councilor Ramos will heads, I believe, will hear this. They'll have their own public hearing, and they'll go through 3 ordinance reads of it to adopt it, hopefully. Or again, they can choose to adopt it with modifications, or deny adoption. But they have the final say. And then once they make that decision, there's 30 days before this becomes effective. So those are kind of the next steps. Changes can be made up until the point that council makes their vote. And then after that, whatever they approve, if there's a need to modify it down the line, they would go through an amendment process very similar to the adoption of this. So that's my presentation, so now we're here for questions. And I know there's questions. Yes.
I guess I'll start. I'm a little confused about residential parking. Just in the area of, and I know I've mentioned this before at meetings, where you have a property and they have 10 cars parked on the grass on the lot all throughout. And we talked one time about, so my question is, can they just be parked on the grass? Should there be any setback? Or are they supposed to have a pervious or hard surface, or?
I can
I
eat-
didn't understand from
I
the,
can-
Hard surface is what I
Yes,
remember, right? When
correct.
I went through that, it was hard surface, so you can't park in the grass,
Yes.
right?
Okay, I
I think
think-
that's what I remember in the.
It is very correct. So
Yeah.
the, the requirement, the general requirements for vehicular use areas are that it has to have a hard surface. For residential uses, that could be a driveway, or they could have a turnaround, or whatever, they can pave it. Cannot be on grass, therefore. That's balanced with the maximum lot coverage, so they can't just pave over an entire lot to get all their parking. So they have that. And we do also have like setbacks for, if it's single family, we have setbacks for like driveways and such, from the, like, side yards. So you can't pave up to your neighbor's lot line.
Or the road.
For larger uses, there's actual setbacks for parking lots. But yes, parking has to be on a surfaced area. It's hard surface, although pervious surfaces that look like, there are permeable surfaces that look hard, but they allow stormwater through. Those would be acceptable for parking areas.
so in those situations, I guess as it gets into, will they be required to remedy that or be grandfathered? Or given a time limit?
Yeah, I understand, yeah. So they will be technically grandfathered. However, from my experience with other communities have gone through this similar thing, that is one that is fairly easy to remedy. Because at some point, we had this discussion about whether dealing with like junk vehicles and stuff like that. If they're junk vehicles or they're like basically kind of deteriorating there's a different process to pull those out of
Right.
there. With other ones, as soon as they like drive away, it's no longer, when they come back, it's no longer protected because it's not like a building was built there, it's kind of a temporary situation. So once they go off to work or something, they won't be able to come back and park in it. So it is theoretically grandfathered, but
It's truly not, though.
it really isn't.
It's truly
Yeah,
not,
I know.
because you're only talking, really, Wendy, is if they sat 3 cars in their thing.
Yeah,
And they always stayed there, okay, we can't touch them, but as soon as this one leaves,
As soon as
oh,
you
you
back-
can't put it back.
Yep.
But they're leaving, I'm sure they're leaving every day. I think it's just, I think what Ramos getting at is there's 6 vehicle owners in that house and they all got to park in a spot and they leave every day.
Yeah.
So the grandfathering's over with.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just no different than if someone's selling a car, say we adopt this thing and 30 days later, someone's selling a car in their front yard. As soon as they sell that car, they can't put another car out there
Right.
next week and sell it, correct?
yeah, or park it or whatever.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay. I just wanna make sure Cheryl.
Oh, no, no,
because
I
there's
agree
really
with
not
that.
a grant, there is, but
It's theoretically
Yeah.
grandfathered, kind of thing. But as soon as they back off of that, they're not parking there.
right.
Right.
So
And
in other
so-
words, it has to change. I
Yeah.
mean, they
Right.
have to,
We
So-
probably, and
There-
honestly, we could probably put something, I can work with Marvin on this, but we could probably put something in there that basically states, because of the temporary nature of parking, it's not considered a nonconformity, like non-conforming site condition. And then once the parking, once the car is removed, you've lost any protection, it has to be surfaced to be parked on.
Right, right.
so I guess one, I'm asking, okay, so essentially they're gonna have to pave it where these cars are. Also, I wonder about the setback, but that would be a question for you, probably, you guys. So would we send notices to those property owners and say, hey, listen, you.
I don't see us doing that.
You
Might
just
be
go by
complaints.
complaint?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean,
yeah.
if I had a whole department of enforcement officers, maybe we could do things differently, but since I'm the only one the city
Right.
has, I'll just handle like everything else. I get a complaint.
Okay,
Go talk to them, but that's limited to the maximum lot coverage. They can't, that's why we did that. You can't pave your whole lot. so
Right.
you can
Yeah.
fit. So
Right.
it's-
Even if they went
it's
and
gonna be
did
better.
that, even if they wanted to park them all there, that still goes to what she protected us on the fact you just can't pour concrete from lot line to
Lot
lot
line.
line and say, you're legal now.
And then if it's a junk vehicle never moving, we've already got stuff outside of.
we've
that.
already got
Yeah.
stuff for that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can work here between now and Tuesday to come up with something just to clarify that, but yeah, I mean, as soon as yeah, it's one of those things, it's not, because it's not a protected parking lot or parking area, it's kind of like a gray area of not really non-conforming or grandfather protection.
Right.
Thank you.
Anyone
Anybody
from the public have questions?
My name's Christian Sexton. I have a couple, just thoughts and observations. First
Sure.
of all, Wendy, I mean, I applaud you and the city for undertaking this. Zoning's not fun, it's complex, there's so much ambiguity. Digging into this preliminary, I think you've done a great job. My only couple thoughts were, I think the goal in mind, and you hit it on your goals, was to remove housing barriers, and really for Josh's sake, administration, enforcement, et cetera. Sorry, I'm free. I think one goal that, my only really thought from 30,000 feet would be, I'm a developer, so it's a land use perspective. And you hit it with your goals, which was make it easier to invest in the city, and flexibility with predictability. I think there's some certain instances, if you look, it's been 30, 40 years, when was the last code adopted? I mean, the city's spot zoned a lot, and there's a lot of places where you have a business use, residential business. And I feel like if we are forward thinking, there's a couple spots where we could go, okay, for example, West High, the neighborhood business district. I think there's other instances, South Side could do some of that out Commercial Avenue. There's a couple little spots off of 3rd Street and 4th Street over by the AAA office. I think if we take a step back and look at the predictability, as a developer, which I don't do anything in town, I do things in Cincinnati, Nashville,
Yeah.
pretty complex zoning codes. So I look at this and I go land use, and my only thought would be, look at some of these instances and go, what's the corridors, where's the high traffic count? Is there a zoning designation that we have an opportunity now to put something in place? And it might not change for 5, 10, 15 years, but if somebody wants to add a dentist office in a single-family house in its own high-traffic area, or a chiropractor office, those type of things, there's a couple spots throughout town where if you look closer, I think you could eliminate some of the problems in the future and allow a developer to come in and not have to do rezone.
Well, let me speak to that a little bit, because maybe I just didn't get into the weeds enough, but
Yeah.
we've actually created a little bit of that. So one of the things that is new to almost all the commercial districts is, one, the ability to do mixed use, not just downtown. And two is, in most of the residential districts, particularly the ones like the office and the transitional stuff, we've allowed for live-work units, which I kind of have always said are kind of like home occupations on steroids. You know it's a business. It's the old
Right.
live above, and I've done that because we're seeing situations where, today's market drive, well, maybe not today's, office is a little sketchy. Let's say we were before COVID, a lot of developers like around where my office is were building, office condos
Right.
that look like townhomes or row houses. And I always ask the question, like, I mean, why wouldn't you have like a dwelling unit above that? Like, why make it all office? And in their case, it was because the demand was just for office, but, and they didn't allow for the live work option, because you have to go through the, you know, building codes and stuff. So, what we did is said, if that is something that somebody wants to do, go ahead. So but we're not anticipating it to be like, right now, somebody might want to do it, but we've tried to open up more options in some of these areas than strictly like commercial.
Yeah, I saw the intent. I think you did a good job at the downtown business district and some of the transition areas.
And that was also why we did the R3 around downtown. Not that we were expecting, you know, a big push to change anything now, but it was to open up the opportunity.
I guess my point would be there's some other instances around Wabash, Third Street, South Broadway, Commercial Avenue, where you're looking at R2,
Yeah,
and you can specifically go, okay, well, there's businesses within, I mean, it would allow the city to not have to do a land use change if somebody, for example, on South Side or Wabash said, you know, this is zoned R2, but it's more conducive to business. I just think there's a couple instances you can look closer at those things. But overall, I mean, I applaud it. This is complex and time consuming.
I agree. My name is Nick Javis. I have a couple questions. One, as it relates to transitional homes.
Mhm.
I'm wondering if there's any definitions that have changed there, or really my main question, I think, has to do with the definition of family and the amount of unrelated people that live together.
so, we have defined, so like a single-family dwelling is, either one family, which is the whole, you know, there's actual like court cases in Ohio that's like, this is what a family is. That does have a certain amount of related people, and there, I think, like up to 2 unrelated. Or a housekeeping unit, which could be up to 5 unrelated people. The reason why we use that, 5 unrelated people living together, so if 5 unrelated people wanted to just be roommates in a single-family home, that is a single-family home. The reason why we use 5 is because I know you don't have quite the building codes that like some of the bigger cities have and stuff like that, but from the state's building code, typically above 5 is where you change occupancy types. It's also like one of the standpoint of the definition of group homes that are allowed in single families, use 5 unrelated. So 5 is kind of consistently used term. So a single family dwelling, even though we still use the term single family, is either one family or one housekeeping unit.
But it's 5.
It's 5 unrelated, or it could be, I mean, if there, at some point, the health department can get involved if there's super over occupancy. You know, 30 family members try to live together, the health department can go after it, but not from a zoning standpoint.
Right.
But, you know, if you have a large family and you're all, you know, then you could. I don't know, I don't even know why the state looks at that differently too, so.
Right. One other thing is curious about if anything's changed around like minimum square footage for buildings, houses mainly.
I actually have the-
1,200 now, maybe it's.
I think we
It's the same.
dropped that,
Okay.
but I do not remember that one off the top of my head. I apologize.
We dropped that in.
I'm sorry, yeah, ask your question again, I think. So-
Minimum dwelling size.
Yeah.
I don't,
Has that changed?
I don't think
I
we
mean, I didn't think we did anything with that though, did we? What you're talking about, square footage of a home?
Yeah,
I don't remember us
I think
changing
we
that.
had
I don't
become
either.
like, doesn't the state require, there is a number? And we
yeah,
kinda
it's
went
very
a little-
small though,
But we went a little above that.
yeah.
We
Yeah,
also-
we've had, and I apologize, we've had so many meetings on it, so I don't remember everything.
Yeah, Of all the discussions we had, that
Right.
was a very small
It's
discussion.
very
I
small.
tend to ask those kind of questions.
That's okay.
No, I know, it's a great question,
We
and
also dropped-
I'll tell you what, I'm gonna learn it tonight too,
Yeah.
because I,
I know we had a discussion about it,
yes.
and I know where it is typically in my code, so.
We dropped
Um,
minimum lot size in certain districts too, which allows for more density.
So the minimum floor area for single-family dwellings is 500 square feet.
Okay,
For other dwelling units is 350. No minimum floor area requirement for dwellings in the CBD.
okay. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy. I did not
I,
remember that.
I knew we had the conversation,
I don't,
but I could not
It's
remember
been
what
a
the
year,
ultimate
you know?
recommendation was, so I had to go back and find that.
okay. All right.
And we can't limit it anymore because we don't have a certified building department that can enforce state law on residential.
I'm glad I learned something tonight, right? I did.
I think you were part of the discussion.
All right.
Oh, yeah, we
That
were,
question is.
A year ago.
but that, yeah.
I'm getting a lot of calls with that. Can I build a tiny home? Can I build a tiny home for my uncle who's moving back?
Well, and the funny thing is, the tiny, I mean, so we have the provision for accessory dwelling units, so you couldn't have
Was
that.
that part of the conversation when we did that, as far as
Yes.
the mother-in-law suite in the
Yeah.
back? Is that-
Right.
Okay, it's coming back to me.
Yeah.
But like that case with the, you know, you could do something a little bit smaller in the back, but it still has to be permanently attached, so it can't be like, like you can't like drive a little tiny home in and sit it on its chassis and all that accessory dwelling.
Right.
It's actually gotta be
Okay,
actually attached to a foundation.
okay.
But these minimum dwelling sizes are for the principal home. But we still also allow an accessory dwelling unit for most,
Right.
So that's what, 20 by 25?
yeah.
Okay,
It's with the cost of everything. That's why people want to do it.
all right.
So that is a tiny home, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Tiny homes actually, I mean, it's
Unless you're
perspective. The tiny home, when you actually look and research tiny homes, when they're used in that terminology, actually tend to be smaller. In the like
That-
two,
that probably
200 to
wouldn't be too bad a
250.
Size, 500.
But 500 from the I mean, you don't see many single-family homes that size, but from the standpoint of what, I know you don't have the state building code, but what the state building codes are looking at from occupancy standpoints, I mean, I lived in a one-bedroom apartment that was 550.
Right, okay.
The other thing to keep in mind is this, what this more than likely does is set up, again, opening up for what the market is. So yeah, somebody might want to do one 500 square foot home somewhere, but we're not seeing an overwhelming desire to develop an entire subdivision of them or something like that. So it's really gonna vary with the market.
I don't have anything.
So, these drafts are available online, I believe.
Yes.
I haven't gone to look. We have the clean version, which is what planning commission has to act of, but I believe also still we have this annotated version, which has footnotes, and we tried to kind of, in these critical pieces, explain like, why do we do this, or, that kind of thing. So this is really, useful to get an understanding of where we were coming from.
And what we post online will include the zoning map.
We do have the zoning map. I mean,
Yeah, where is that? I couldn't find it attached to this.
Yeah, it should be.
I have that. I can give that to Joshua. I mean, I've sent that in the past, so
Yeah.
I even have it with me.
And that's, I think on Tuesday at the planning commission meeting, that's really what we're gonna focus on.
Yeah, because there's some tweaks before Tuesday.
Yeah,
that
there's
we're gonna
tweaks.
do.
Like, for instance, what Christian has suggested.
Right there it is, we'll talk about it a little bit.
Yeah.
I think we're gonna,
Yeah, like, and one other thing I didn't point out when I spoke earlier, like Tuscarawas Avenue, that's a commercial corridor. I don't see any problem with putting an overlay or changing the base zoning. It's not gonna change overnight, but if you look at the spot zoning up and down Tusk Avenue and Wabash, I think there's some opportunity there to be forward thinking.
And there's a lot of residential along that.
Right.
and that's a lot
A
to
lot.
stay.
Yeah, but, looking into the future, will that become more of a business corridor? I think it is the question he's raising.
Yeah,
And-
with the
and do we
homes that
need
are
to-
there.
Well, we also had the question about East High, too.
Well, East
Yeah.
High, exactly, and South Broadway, like from commercial to, Hummel Valley Road, or Hummel Avenue.
And southeast side of commercial, or southwest side to match southeast side of commercial, I
A
think.
good example is already East High. It's all, could be, I don't know the base zoning now, but it appears to be the red commercial, and there's,
It's zone business now,
Is
that
it?
red is.
there's residential
That's what-
business
yeah.
there.
So I guess everybody give that some thought, and then on Tuesday, next Tuesday, we'll really focus in on that.
Yeah, I may go ahead and have this printed out at a large scale and bring that with me.
Yeah, I appreciate that, yeah.
And this is stuff that changes a decade from now.
Right.
It's not like a week from.
This is, this is our look into the future. You know, where the city's gonna be growing and how we're able to, manage the growth properly. So you try to minimize the gray areas we've had in the past and minimize, heartburn.
That's, I should have put that as like one of the project goals. All right. Well, like I said, we can, maybe on the same page or whatever, where there's this or be posted or something, leave an email where somebody can send comments.
Yeah, you can send them to me, or, that's jday@newphilaoh.com, or to J Mathias, which is Josh Mathias, @newphilaoh.com.
Thank you, sir.
And then we'll share those with Wendy,
Yes.
and, she'll bring the revisions next Tuesday. Next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, right here is the planning commission meeting. So those folks watching at home, if you'd like to comment, send us some emails. If you'd like to attend the meeting, you're more than welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
1 hour and 6 minutes.